Good morning, everyone. So, first things first, let me tell you that this is probably going to be my last video for this academic year, for this school. And, well, it's been an honor being your teacher, and I'm very happy of the progress that you've all made, seriously. But now let's get to it. Now, in the past month and a half, we have discussed some of the major events that have taken place in the ancient and medieval world. Some of you may have noticed that since the moment we discussed the conquest of America, we sort of crossed the boundaries between what people generally see as the Middle Ages and what people generally see as the early modern world. Now, this is because some historians, like the French historian Jacques Le Goff, think that the Middle Ages in Europe only ended with the French Revolution. And to a certain extent, depending on the point of view, they might be right. The French Revolution was this huge event, this culmination of a long period of changes in how people believed that a country should be run. And the revolution itself really shook Europe to the core, and with Europe, the entire world, because we are at the beginning of the period of time in which European countries started expanding across the entire world. Well, not really at the beginning, we're in the middle. To this day, the way we think of politics, democracy, human rights, and social groups all comes down to the changes brought by the French Revolution and to its three words motto: Liberté, Egalité, Fraternité, freedom, equality, and solidarity. Today, we're going to look at the causes and the consequences of the French Revolution, and in particular, we will be looking at the following points. We'll be looking at the background, so the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Then we're asking ourselves what were the causes of the French Revolution, what were the short-term consequences of the revolution, so between 1789 and 1815, and then we will look at the long-term consequences of the revolution. Why are we talking about this event? Why is it such an important watershed for us? There is no model answer today, but there are just some suggestions on how to answer the final question, which is what are the causes and consequences of the French Revolution? I have given you some sentence starters and some instructions on how to answer the question. There are 3 levels, as always. You have to describe when and why the revolution happened. You have to explain what were its short-term consequences, speak of Napoleon and all that. And then you have to explain what were the most important long-term consequences, so how it influenced us, how the changes brought by the French Revolution made us in 2020 think differently. Let's start from the beginning, actually from before the beginning of the revolution. So, to understand the French Revolution, first we need to mention the 7 Years' War, which was a conflict between the European major powers that lasted between 1756 and 1763. It is a fascinating and incredibly complicated history, but we don't have time to discuss it because this video will probably be very long as it is. So for now, you should just remember these 3 essential things. First, France and Britain were fighting against each other. Second, for the first time in human history, a war was fought on 3 continents: Europe, America, and Asia. This is a huge change. Before then, a war between Britain and France would be fought in Europe. Now it's fought in Europe, in America, and in India. It's World War Zero, effectively. And 3, the war was incredibly expensive for all the countries involved, both in terms of money and, of course, in terms of human lives lost. At the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain was desperately in need of money, so the British Parliament decided to increase the taxes on its North American colonies. And as we studied at the beginning of the year, this didn't really sit well with the American colonies. They didn't really like it, and they started their own American Revolution in 1776. France, which was historically one of Britain's rivals, so one of the enemies of Britain, was keen to help anything that could damage Britain's power. Something happened that could do Britain some damage, France was on it. So they helped the Americans with warships, military advisors that trained the inexperienced American recruits into a formidable fighting force, and most importantly, with huge amounts of money. The American Revolution was a success. Today we have a country named the United States of America, which started with that revolution in 1776. and Britain lost one of its most important colonies. But there was a problem. Now France was completely broke because they spent so much money helping the American rebels. And the French population was actually starving and had been starving for a while. So on the 14th of July 1789, incidentally this video will be published on the 14th of July, a crowd of citizens in Paris who were tired of the situation stormed the Bastille, which was the prison where the opponents of the kings of France were locked, like the Tower of London in England. And even though the prison itself was more or less empty, it was a huge symbolic act. It was the people taking control of the government, rebelling against the government. A constitution, so a law explaining what were the powers of the kings and what were the powers of the government, what they could do and what they could not do, was written in 1789, and 4 years later, in 1793, the king and most of the nobles were decapitated using a new invention, the guillotine. It was the beginning of the French Revolution, of a fundamental period of European history. What were the causes of the revolution? Now, as always, when we look at the causes of any historical event, particularly if it is something huge, like the French Revolutions or like the Crusades, as we did a couple of weeks ago, we need to ask ourselves two fundamental questions. Why did it happen there, in that particular place, and why did it happen then, at that particular time? Because things... there needs to be a series of coincidences, a series of factors that happen in a particular space and a particular time for something so big to happen. We've already said that the people of France were starving and that they were desperate for better living conditions. But this was neither the first time nor the last time similar things would happen. France and other countries already had similar situations many times, in which the population was starving, in which there was a terrible economic crisis. They had something like that many, many times. However, it was not enough by itself to unleash a huge revolution. There need to be other things. So, why did it happen? At the time, France was ruled by a medieval system based on estates. Medieval because it was inherited more or less directly from the Middle Ages, from the age of knights and popes and so on. And again, this system was based on estates. Estates are social groups. The population of France, all the population of France, was divided into three groups. The nobles, the clergy, who were like the bishops and the priests, and everyone else. The nobles and the clergy were, of course, the richest groups in France. They had lands, they had public money, they were very rich, but they did not pay taxes. It was the rest of the population, everyone else, so the merchants, the peasants, the craftsmen, and everyone else, who had to shoulder the burden of paying for all the expenses of the French government. And it didn't help that while the population was starving, the royal court at Versailles was living a very extravagant and rich life in houses filled with gold and silver decoration, so they didn't really like that. However, by 1789, the society of France had changed a lot since the Middle Ages. It used to be that the third estate, so everyone else we've talked about before, was not as powerful. They were not as rich. But now they were. Okay, by the end of the 18th century, the third estates, the commoners, were more powerful than ever, and they wanted to have some form of power if they were to pay all the taxes. If you keep giving money to some cause, to some government, you want to have some power. Otherwise, you say you just won't pay. Britain, another country where non-nobles, so the third estate, were becoming increasingly powerful, had an elected parliament. So this sort of people could be elected into parliament, they could complain about the situation, and they could do something to change it. However, France had no such thing, and something similar to parliament, the Estates General, was only called once or twice every 100 years. It was not enough. The people of France, the third estate, wanted to have a say in how the country was run, because they just couldn't stand it any longer. And to do that, they needed to get rid of the king and get rid of the old system of the estates. At the time, France was also the birthplace of an intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. We have talked about it at the very beginning of the year when talking about the American Revolution, if you remember. Philosophers and thinkers of the Enlightenment had begun talking about things like freedom, democracy, citizenship, and republics. And they began to say that maybe a country should be ruled by its people and not by someone who claimed to be chosen by God. This is evident in the three words that were chosen as the motto of the French revolutionaries: Liberté, Egalité, Fraternité, freedom, equality, and solidarity. The revolutionaries wanted to be free, they wanted to be equal to each other, and they wanted to treat each other like brothers and sisters. These factors, so the poverty of the population, the old system of the estates, the increase in power of a non-noble class, so the fact that the non-nobles were becoming more powerful with time, combined with the importance of these ideas of freedom and equality of the Enlightenment, were the long-term causes that made the revolution possible. Eventually, when people were not able to have it anymore, to resist anymore to these terrible living conditions, they rebelled and they started the actual revolution. Now, by the way, this painting is the Liberty Guiding the People, is a painting symbolizing the French Revolution. What were the short-term consequences of the revolution? Now, it is a watershed moment in world history, as we said already, and its consequences are still felt to this day. So when talking about its consequences, so what happened after and because of the revolution, we need to divide it into categories: the short-term consequences, so what happened between 1789 and 1815, and the long-term consequences, so how it still ripples to this day. In the short term, the revolution led to political changes in France, which caused a long series of terrible wars in Europe. France became first a constitutional monarchy, in which the powers of the kings were limited by what was decided by Parliament. But then, eventually, King Louis XVI was not very okay with it. He tried to escape the country, and he was beheaded by the guillotine in 1793. And the country became a full republic, ruled by elected officials, so with elections and a parliament and so on. This period, between 1793 to 1795, is known as the Revolutionary Terror. Terror because the ruling officials, people like Robespierre, were so afraid of a return of the monarchy that they killed everyone who dared to think differently. This meant sentencing 3,000 people to the guillotine while leaving another 10,000 people to die in prison. The Revolutionary Republic was also hated by the surrounding monarchies, including, of course, Britain, because Britain always hated France, and now that France had this dangerous revolution, they hated it even more. In general, the surrounding European monarchies hated France because they were afraid that their own people could rebel and kill their kings, as the French had done. This fear led to a series of wars in which countries like Austria, Prussia, the Netherlands, and Britain invaded France, and as you know, during wars, especially these threatening, difficult wars and long wars, generals and military leaders can become more powerful and popular, as we have seen when we talked about Julius Caesar. One such general was a young man you see pictured in here named Napoleon Bonaparte. He was an unparalleled military genius. Seriously, if you're interested in military history, go look him up, because mind-blowing. And he was able to gain the support of the most important members of the French Republic. He would later overthrow the Republican government and proclaim himself Emperor of the French. He asked the Pope to come to Paris and crown him, as used to be done by Charlemagne, a medieval Emperor of the Franks. But if Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, with the Pope giving him the crown, Napoleon just took the crown from the hand of the Pope, put it on his own head and said, "God gave it to me and I will keep it." to symbolize that he was even above the Pope. It was a huge step. As emperor, Napoleon launched the French armies to the conquest of Europe, and he successfully occupied most of the continent. It took a grand total of 7 extremely violent wars before Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 by a force of English, Prussians and Dutch soldiers led by the Duke of Wellington. And your answer is, why do I care? Now, why do you care? The Battle of Waterloo was so important that one of London's main train stations is named after it, as you know, London Waterloo, and that one of London's most famous squares, Trafalgar Square, is named after the naval battle where the French Navy was finally defeated. The 2 people who defeated his army and his navy, Admiral Nelson and the Duke of Wellington, have been buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, which is the highest honor an English person can receive. It means being buried in the same cathedral as the kings and queens of England. These examples should give you an idea of how important Napoleon was for the history of Europe. He passed through the continent like a hurricane. It was seemingly impossible to stop. Britain was able to resist thanks to his navy, and the country was so grateful to the man who defeated Napoleon that the country treated them like kings after their death. So those were the short-term consequences, the Revolutionary Wars, the Wars of Napoleon, and all that jazz. But what were the long-term consequences? In the long term, so after 1815, the French Revolution completely changed the way Europeans thought about politics and power. The most visible effect was the wave of revolutionary movements that overwhelmed most European countries, including Britain, with the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, with people asking for more rights and for more democracy. What many people wanted was a constitution, a written document saying what the kings could and could not do with their powers and limiting their power. Before constitutions, monarchs and kings can do pretty much whatever they want. If they have a constitution, you have a contract saying, no, you cannot do that. It's written here that you cannot ask for this many taxes, that you cannot imprison people for what they say. This is what they wanted. With time, these revolutions, especially those of 1848, became national movements, which fought for the unification of countries like Italy and Germany, which at the time did not exist and were ruled by small regional states. The fact that everyone who generally speaks the same language and has the same idea is a nation is one of the major, and therefore nations should have their own country, is one of the major consequences of the French Revolution. In continental Europe, so Germany, France, Austria, Italy, Belgium and the Netherlands and others, the passage of Napoleon and of his revolutionary armies also brought an end to the old system of the estates, so the division of people into categories in nobles, clergy and commoners, and introduced to Europe the idea that maybe all citizens were born with equal rights, and there was no reason why the nobles and the clergy should be treated differently. This was the birth of the idea of universal human rights, that every person, regardless of their gender, their birth and their race, should have the same rights and the same duties. The government and every other institution should think of people as human beings who are born equal and not as different according to their birth. A noble is no different in terms of what he can and cannot do, in terms of the taxes he has to pay, in terms of what is asked of him. A noble is not different from a commoner. The fact that we give this for granted, because this is how we think, we are all equal, we live in a democracy. Even in Britain, which is a country which did not experience a similar revolution, this fact is probably the most important and significant legacy of the French Revolution. So, again, those were the facts for today. Today's question is what were the causes and the consequences of the French Revolution? You have to describe when and why the French Revolution happened, so 1789, and then discuss the causes. You have to explain what were the short-term consequences, so Reign of Terror and Napoleon. And then you have to explain, if you want to reach the gold level, what were the most important long-term consequences of the revolution. In this case, I would say the birth of the idea of human rights and the wave of revolutions all over Europe and all that. As we said, this was the last lesson, the last video lesson for this year, I think. There might be another one. I will see. It's a bit complicated. I was honored to be your teacher, and I'm looking forward to read what you can write. See you next time.